In my last video, we talked about the Gunsmith Cats OVA, a cult favorite bit of 90s animation that I really love. Despite being based on the manga of the same name, the OVA didn't adapt any specific chapters or storylines, and because of this, sort of acts like its own standalone piece. You can sort of treat it as a trailer for the manga, because if you liked one, you'll definitely like the other. In this video, we'll be diving into the comic, what makes it different, how it goes a bit farther in places, and most importantly, why you should read the fucking manga. The good news with the Gunsmith Cats manga is that if you've watched the OVA, you've gotten a pretty good introduction. Chapters in the manga pretty much take on one of two forms: one-offs and cases. One-offs are pretty self-explanatory. Less frequent, short little one-chapter stories, often just conversations between characters that explore one topic or another. Often these focus on guns, a topic that the manga covers much more deeply, with one early example being a chapter about Rally losing her trusty CZ-75. She opines that the CZ-75, the old model of course, not the garbage new one, how it's truly the greatest handgun ever made, and wishes that she could find a new one, which of course by the end of the chapter she does. The rest of the chapters follow cases in more traditional arcs, albeit short ones. I would liken the story structure to something kind of like Black Lagoon or Darker Than Black. Missions that are independent from each other and last long enough to have some depth, but not so long that you have to keep asking, seriously, are we still on Namek? They also have common through lines and recurring adversaries that give the feeling of a larger continuity without you needing to be too focused on what's going on. This is a format that I tend to prefer. In fact, the two series I listed as examples are some of my favorites. Instead of focusing on a primary goal which either leads to a lack of side stories or makes those side stories feel like a huge waste of time, the use of short vignettes lets an author tell a lot of different stories with varying levels of character development. Some cases are their own entirely self-contained stories, while others tie more deeply into the backstories of the main characters. There's one that involves Rally's connection to her father and how it's responsible for her line of work today. There's another one that flashes back to May's life growing up on the streets and how the man that saved her also taught her about explosives. But then there's also one that sees Rally and the gang helping a magic man expose his bitch ex-wife and get his kids back. The cases strike a good balance between recurring villains with longer stories and short, not quite one-offs that add a little bit of variety into the mix. This makes for a good structure because overall, the manga's not exactly long. Gunsmith Cats is split between its original run, which spanned only 75 chapters, and the sequel series Gunsmith Cats Burst, which ran for 51 chapters. With a combined total of 126 chapters, it's a quicker read than a lot of other series out there, and the shortest one I've covered so far. The synergy between cases and one-offs is such that there's a relatively large amount of content compared to the page count, and the breadth of stories that get told is wider than you'd expect. In a lot of ways, the Gunsmith Cats manga is the material of the OVA, but turned up to 11. As Kenichi Sanada himself would put it, more action, more sexier, more awesome, more excitement. Manga is a much more personal medium than animation. After all, one is generally from one or two creators and the other is from an entire team. The result of this is parts of Sanada bleeding in to the manga. Judged by his previous work as a character and mecha designer for Bubblegum Crisis and the Golf Force series, it's clear that Kenichi has a taste for hot girls and hot weaponry. Gunsmith Cats is an extension of those interests with his love of muscle cars thrown into the mix. Sanada has also professed himself in many interviews to be a fan of Western media, primarily action movies. There's an entire chapter later in this series where characters just talk about their favorite movies and spit trivia back and forth. With movies like Terminator 2, Star Wars, Das Boot, and the general category of Chuck Norris being mentioned, it's pretty easy to get a grasp on his taste. The man is also a big fan of the Blues Brothers. During a panel at Anime Central 2019, he said that he owns 3 different versions of the movie on Laserdisc and has taped every single different Japanese voice dub live off of TV. He said he's also seen the movie over 100 times. This is of course what led to Chicago being the setting for the series. Sanada even took a trip to the city in order to obtain reference photos and experience it for himself. The manga makes use of the city in ways that are better and worse. there's a lot of cool moments that take place in real-world locations. While some of it's just background art, like Raleigh standing in front of the planetarium, or May and Becky walking by Northwestern Hospital, other times it comes up during car chases as characters try to figure out the best route, or when a drug deal goes down in a cemetery that actually exists. The added detail is a nice bit of effort, and I found myself repeatedly pulling up my Maps app trying to look up wherever they were talking about, and being surprised by the accuracy. It's also fun to see the setting manifest in ways beyond just locations, like the uniforms of the Chicago PD. But it doesn't always work, of course, and there's definitely some awkward moments where it's clear that the author isn't familiar with the setting. Sometimes these can feel like the result of laziness. It's hard to keep coming up with real-world locations for events to transpire in a city on the other side of the planet that you've only been to a handful of times. Understandably, a lot ends up happening in nameless warehouses at undisclosed locations. But other issues have a lot more to do with a lack of cultural understanding. One of my favorite examples of this is early on when a mobster tells another guy, "You'll never deal coke in Chicago or all of Illinois," as if there was somewhere else in the state that has a big market for coke. Another incongruity tends to happen with architecture. If the scene takes place in the Loop with backgrounds from referenced photos and real locales, everything looks great. But when things move away from downtown, or occasionally out towards the burbs, we start to see a lot of houses that look more like modern Japanese buildings, which is to say we have houses that look like concrete boxes that somebody stuck a door on. Bathrooms are another example. You're not likely to see a Japanese-style area to shower before getting into the tub in your average American home. And you're also not likely to see people bathing together. Minor details like this are just parts of life you don't really think about, and these moments don't really pull you out of the comic because you're reading a manga, so these are the kind of things you expect to see. But if you're trying to suspend your disbelief and see this as actually something happening in America, it just kind of feels weirdly off. Despite these minor hiccups, the setting overall really does a lot to set Gunsmith Cats apart from other series, and it gives the series a unique feel that I think adds a lot to it overall. Another of Sanada's interests on full display in the manga is his fascination with guns. Whether this passion was born out of a love for action movies or something different is unclear. However, his interest in the history, construction, and use of firearms could not be more apparent. Guns in Japan are about as close to illegal to own as you can get without a full-on prohibition. Citizens are allowed to own them, however, regulations involving licensing, rigorous and repeated testing, random compliance checks, and strict consequences for misuse make it incredibly difficult to do so. Even those that go through the effort are limited to guns that are just meant for hunting rather than anything involving personal defense. Of course, Japan is such a safe country that it's not as if many people there need to own a gun to protect themselves. Because of this, gun subculture in Japan tends to center more around realistic models if there's any actual ownership of a gun involved. However, gun otaku are just as obsessively dedicated to their hobby as any other Japanese subculture. Dark Horse's version of the Gunsmith Cats Burst manga includes lots and lots of inserts from Kenichi Sanada describing various models of gun, styles of ammunition, explanations of their various mechanisms, the history of guns, and why each of these models, ammunitions, and mechanisms were invented. This spills onto the pages of the manga itself through the dialogue of the characters, primarily Raleigh. And by the end of the series, chapters end up becoming lessons on what guns to use, how best to use them, and why they're just the coolest. What should be clear here is that if you're someone who's anti-gun, or guns are something that make you uncomfortable, then this manga definitely is not for you. That's not to say things get political. Sanada never really goes as far as to advocate for anything, which makes sense considering he's from a country that has pretty firmly made up its mind about guns, and he has no reason to opine on the regulatory decision of a country he's only been to a handful of times. If you don't have a problem with that subject matter, I can say for certain that it's definitely educational. I myself am what some refer to as a no-guns, and I'm not particularly knowledgeable about them. I learned a heck of a lot from Sanada, and I think that, in many cases, it added to the reading experience. What weapon a character is using, its strengths, its weaknesses, is often a key part of an encounter. In one shootout, the villain purposefully targets Raleigh's gun with her blackjack, knowing that the slide rails on the CZ-75 are thin, and that hitting the pistol from the side would bend the frame and keep it from firing. Sure, my gun got damaged and now I can't shoot would function in this situation, but the passion behind coming up with a detailed rationale based on an intricate understanding of the systems involved in the weapon really adds a certain level of charm and sets the series apart from others. It's like when an author clearly spent a lot of time reading about a weird topic and decided to shoehorn it in because they thought it was cool. Except that this is a lot more coherent than stag beetle wrestling. Mini-May's explosives are an interesting contrast to how guns are handled, because while Sonata clearly put a lot of work into understanding different kinds of explosives and explaining their various applications, it's never quite as detailed and it isn't really packed with the same enthusiasm you can feel when guns are being displayed. That being said, I think some of that might be me misconstruing a lack of accuracy with a lack of passion. Unlike the guns in the series, the explosives don't really work as you would expect them to. We saw an example of this in the OVA during the home invasion scene when May dropped like 20 grenades on a guy only for him to stagger away lightly charred like Daffy Duck, when he should be like really dead. Another example of this is when May sets a bomb under Bill's surveillance van and it just kind of tosses them around and blows off one of their wheels instead of producing a much more realistic result. The explosives never seem to pack as much of a punch as they really should in Gunsmith Cats, but some of that is more by design than by accident. Grenades are not really known for being non-lethal weapons. Even theoretically non-lethal flashbangs can kill someone under the right conditions and more commonly can cause long-term or permanent damage. It's hard to have a character specialize in explosives and keep things semi-realistic without a lot of blown off limbs and people slowly bleeding to death from shrapnel. The compromise in the manga is that May uses her own custom grenades. Her May specials are just gunpowder in a casing, without any of the metal fragments and other stuff that grenades have inside to inflict maximum damage. It would seem to me like the concussive force of the explosion and the casing itself would still deal a lot of damage. But I'm no expert, and the purpose isn't to make these safe, just a little less lethal. The end result of this is May using explosives to varying degrees of destructiveness, and you just kind of have to accept it. The same issue is tackled slightly differently for Rally. Not wanting your main character to constantly be killing people is a bit of a tough sell when pretty much every conflict takes the form of a shootout. The approach here doesn't sacrifice accuracy, but it does come with its own issues. Rally does her best not to kill people if she doesn't have to. We see this in the first episode of the OVA when she chooses to shoot what the internet tells me is the magazine of a shotgun, rather than shooting the man holding it. Rally is a fantastic shot, and she frequently proves that she doesn't need to kill to win a showdown by shooting an assailant's trigger finger, taking out the bottom of their magazine, causing the bullets to fall out, or destroying the hammer so the gun won't fire. By the end of the series, Rally has built up a bit of a reputation around the Chicago underground for not killing anyone she doesn't have to. There are times where this starts to feel a bit silly. I always get frustrated when bad guys take a hostage and the heroes just lay down their weapons. You know that surrendering is just going to get everyone killed and the villain's not going to stick to their word and give the hostage back. It's even worse when it's a villain they've dealt with before and they've been in this exact same situation and it didn't work that time either. Although the most insufferable of these kinds of moments is when the good guys have a hostage of their own, then give up that hostage while letting the bad guys keep theirs. It's terrible negotiating. But as silly as it can get, Rally trying not to kill people makes sense. This isn't Death Wish and she isn't Charles Bronson. And, unlike a 90-minute action movie, a long-running series requires characters to be held accountable for their actions in order to stay believable and relatable. Rally has moments in the manga where she has to deal with the psychological effects of what she does, the people she's had to kill, the victims she couldn't save. She feels real guilt for her mistakes, and it puts weight behind her efforts not to make them again. The result is that it's much more believable when a crook with his gun pointed at our heroine says that Rally won't shoot unless they shoot first. In addition to guns, another primary passion of Sonata's that forms the foundation of Gunsmith Cats is cars. Cool cars. Fast cars. Muscle cars. The only real outlet for this in the OVA is Rally's 1967 Ford Shelby Mustang Cobra GT500, which I learned while scripting this is, I guess, just called a Ford Mustang GT500. But because it was designed by Shelby and uses a lot of Cobra imagery, it's frequently referred to as her Shelby Cobra. But there's also a recurring antagonist getaway driver named Riff Raff who drives a car that's actually called an AC-427 Cobra, and that's made by Shelby, meaning that it's actually a Shelby Cobra, but she also drives a Viper, which is a different car named after a snake, and if any of this is confusing to you, congratulations, you are also not a car person. Listen, I've watched Top Gear. I think James Bond drives cool cars. I've played Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2, but that's about the extent of it. For that reason, the car talk in Gunsmith Cats fails to really grab me. But if you're someone that can tell the difference between a carburetor and a catalytic converter, which I had to Google to make sure that those weren't the same part, then you'll probably enjoy all of the detailed descriptions of the modifications people have made to their cars, the different models of rare and exciting muscle cars that show up, and Sonata stroking off about how classic 1970s American-made V8-powered vehicles are just the best there's ever been. The car talk present in the manga is at least decently explained. I do feel like I learned a little bit here and there, but unless it's your kind of thing, you'll probably find yourself skimming over that dialogue more often than not. But the good news is that Sonata's passion for automotive doesn't just mean long expository dumps about horsepower and whatever. It also means badass car chases. The manga is packed with them, and most cases turn into a chase at some point or another. You've got 150-mile-per-hour chases on the highway, a sports car on the street versus a Hummer cutting through the off-road, long-distance marathon chases over multiple states, and quite a few more straightforward races. Throughout them, cars flip, spin out, ramp off stuff, they pop two-wheelers, and at one point, two of them pop a two-wheeler at the same time up against each other to avoid running somebody over. There are all kinds of cool moves that would probably be completely impossible for even the most trained stunt driver to pull off in real life. Of course, for a chase to be exciting, you can't just have one driver completely outclassing the other, and Rally finds her match and consistent competition behind the wheel in the form of the Road Buster, Bean Bandit. He may have a silly name, but Bean is 100% American badass. One of the most revered transporters in Chicago and beyond, this towering 6'5" behemoth is indestructible in a fight and unstoppable in an automobile. He's the first character we come across that can match Rally behind the wheel, and even more than that, he outclasses her. On foot, he's still a force to be reckoned with. His height isn't just for show. Bean also sports superior strength and endurance. The man can take a punch, a knife, or even a bullet and keep on going, much to the terror of those that cross him. Nearly every piece of clothing he wears is armored, down to his bandana, but his jacket is his signature. Equipped with ballistic plates and chainmail, it can stand up to anything short of a high-powered rifle. It weighs a figurative ton, which probably contributes to his muscular physique. All of this means that Bean's first approach in a fight is to tank whatever comes his way and bear down on his foes like an unstoppable Terminator. He gets shot, stabbed, stun gunned, shot again, nailed in the face with a smoke grenade, and then shot some more, but he keeps coming. He uses his fists quite a bit, but his real weapon of choice are throwing knives. It may seem unusual for someone to bring a knife to a gunfight, especially in the world of Gunsmith Cats. But Bean demonstrates on a regular basis just how little he needs guns. A knife from his hand is basically a bullet already, just bigger and sharper. Bean is a simple man. He likes cars, he likes beer, and he likes ribs. But his simplicity should not be mistaken for stupidity. You don't survive as the best transporter in Chicago, stay on the right side of the mob, and avoid capture by the police by being stupid. Bean knows how to get the job done right. He misleads the feds by doubling back, switching vehicles, and taking complicated routes. And he has more than a few strategies for breaking up police roadblocks. He has a good understanding of how other people think, especially criminals. He's good enough to know when he's getting played, or when he's likely to get double-crossed, but that doesn't mean things always go his way. Bean is at his core a mercenary, a professional, and that can be a bit of a curse for him at times. Being a professional means that you operate by a set of rules. For Bean, the contract with his client is paramount. If you're paying him to get the job done, he will get it done, no matter the cost or moral implications. Something that comes with the territory is that he's not picky about his clients. So long as they're paying up front and they're honest with the terms of the job, and they don't double-cross him, it doesn't matter who they are. This means that Bean frequently clashes with Rally as an antagonist, even working for the primary villain of the series at one point, something that wounds Rally after they had built something of a rapport together. Being a professional involves a great deal of trust. Bean has a very strict code of honor. He follows his own rules to the letter. He does the job he's being paid for. No more, no less. He doesn't turn on his clients. He doesn't let personal relationships get in the way. He has a reputation for success and reliability, and that's what keeps him in business. He has to trust people that aren't really deserving of trust. People don't want to hire a driver who asks unnecessary questions, so Bean does it. He often takes his employers at their word. It's rude to treat someone trying to give you a job like they're a dishonest scumbag, even if you know they actually are a dishonest scumbag. Because of this, Bean can end up getting betrayed or double-crossed quite a bit. He gives his employers the benefit of the doubt out of respect, and does it with the knowledge that if they do double-cross him, he's smart enough, strong enough, and wily enough to come out on top. And once he's been double-crossed, the rats that do it don't tend to live long enough to benefit from their betrayal. Over the course of the series, Rally and Bean become something akin to friends. He recognizes her skill and professionalism, and she recognizes his sense of honor and capacity to do a lot of good, provided the good guys are the ones paying him. Rally even gets Bean to agree to stop running drugs by winning a bet that she can prevent him from completing a cross-country narcotics delivery. The two have an interesting relationship. It's more of mutual respect and reliance rather than anything romantic, although they do get in some flirting now and then. They influence each other quite a bit as Rally pulls Bean towards the side of good, but Bean pulls Rally deeper into lawlessness. Bean ends up a pretty major character across the original run of Gunsmith Cats, and he ends up being even more important in the continuation, Gunsmith Cats Burst, where he plays a major role in each of the arcs and actually ends up kind of stealing away some of the focus. One of the cases in Burst centers around an illegal street race limited to the best drivers around and only allowing cars with V8 engines, and while Rally is part of the race, the real focus is on Bean and his newly introduced nemesis, someone who only appears in Burst, Lieutenant Percy Bacharach. Percy is obsessed with taking Bean off the street by any means necessary. He's the definition of a loose cannon cop and favors the idea of killing Bean in an accident over actually capturing him. His entry into the V8 race and attempts to execute Bean are more the basis for that arc than anything having to do with Rally. The two take a lot of focus throughout the rest of Burst as well. Of course, there's a reason for this, and it's that Bean and Percy are a lot more important to Sonata than they might originally appear. You see, before Gunsmith Cats, there was Riding Bean, Sonata's first attempt to create a crime-action Chicago thriller series. The manga only lasted 4 chapters before the magazine publishing it went under and it was completely lost to the ages. The Dark Horse version of the GSC manga includes these 4 chapters, and you can see a lot of similarities and differences between the two, but it was only just starting, so there's not a lot of meat there. There was also a 45-minute OVA that was originally produced with the intent to have the anime run as a series. Percy and Rally, albeit a different version of Rally, only ever appear in the OVA as the manga was shut down before it even got to them. It's unfortunate that both attempts at producing a long-running series, whether it be the anime or the manga, ended up petering out before anything substantial manifested. And it's likely that Percy's inclusion in the series was an attempt to tell stories that never got their chance thanks to the cancellation, something we're not unfamiliar with on this series. The fact that Gunsmith Cats itself is sort of a retooling of the original ideas and characters of Riding Bean is evidence that Sonata wasn't done with the concept. Further proof of that is Kenichi Sonata kickstarting a revival of Riding Bean back in 2018. The revival shares a name with the original, despite being its own world with sort of a blending of the original Riding Bean and Gunsmith Cats. Riding Bean, from the manga to the OVA to the kickstarted reboot with its successes and failings, are really enough to be their own separate video, so I'm not going to go into any more detail here, but hopefully I can talk about them later in more depth. After the initial failure of Riding Bean in 1988, Sonata succeeded with Gunsmith Cats. It ran from 1991 to 1997. At the time, it had a fairly decent ending, the kind you see in a lot of anime, where we leave on a note that indicates things will just keep going on as they are, even though the story is ending. Sonata moved on to another manga called Canon God Exaxion, and worked on it until 2004. Rather than move on to a different project afterwards, he made the decision to return to his previous work and started Gunsmith Cats Burst, which could be described as a sequel, but it picks up pretty much where the previous one left off, and it's more of a continuation than anything else. Burst does, however, take a slightly different form in that it tells somewhat longer stories over a lot more chapters. The art style also feels a bit different, but of course that's to be expected when there's 7 or so years between 2 series for someone's method to develop. Burst also happens to have the dishonor of what most fans consider to be a really, really bad ending. Some people make a rather extreme claim that you should just skip Burst altogether, and I disagree with this. Don't get me wrong, the ending is atrocious for reasons I'll get into, but the rest of Burst is still enjoyable. I can't say it's as good as the first run, but it's still an enjoyable read if you stop somewhere around chapter 27 or 28. And even after that, the quality doesn't dip, it just gets frustrating. But to understand that frustration, you have to understand the third and final pillar of Sonata's passion that serves as the foundation for Gunsmith Cats: sleaze. Sleaze is something that permeates the B-movie schlock of the 1980s. Horror films, action movies, comedies, all of them use sex and nudity to sell tickets in a time when the mysteries of the female form weren't just a mouse click away. As a series created by a man who likely enjoys canon films, it makes sense that Gunsmith Cats includes a lot of sex paired with its violence. Stories about the seedy underbelly of the city would not be complete without prostitutes and drug dealers. Throw in the time-honored tradition of anime fan service and you've got a mix that stays wrapped in plastic and not sold to under 18s at Barnes & Noble. If Barnes & Noble still even exists. The manga is filled with exposed chests, butts, and lingerie. Characters frequently have their clothes ripped off and torn during confrontations. Sometimes pants just get pulled off for very little reason. Many of the chapter title pages feature pin-up-style drawings, frequently with some degree of nudity. Sex is definitely a huge component of the series, and it almost borders on silly at times. But it goes beyond just fan service. Sexual themes are pervasive throughout the series. They're part of characters' backgrounds, they're part of the story. This is the kind of series where getting information out of a potential informant or infiltrating an enemy operation might require some sexual favors or posing as a whore. These elements of the series can be a positive or a negative depending on the reader. Some people like to seek sexual content in their media. For them, that might be the main draw, while the story is more of an afterthought. For others, the constant sex and nudity might be off-putting. The underworld is a grimy place, and the villains that inhabit it are just as seedy. The kind of vile men who push drugs and engage in organized crime are not above taking advantage of the women they've taken hostage. The series does occasionally dip into the kind of sexploitation that certain people take issue with. You see, this is where things start to get a little tricky. I'm not usually someone to give any kind of a content warning. Generally, I think if you're not okay with sexual content, you're probably not a big fan of anime to begin with. So I doubt I need to warn someone watching this video about fan service. However, there's definitely a spectrum for how you handle this kind of content. And as it stands, there are a few sensitive topics that are a part of the story of Gunsmith Cats that sadly are not handled very well. Like I said, I'm not really a fan of disclaimers, but I also understand that when you recommend something to someone, you have a bit of a responsibility to let people know what they're getting into. One hot button issue that people have become very vocal about online recently is the tendency of anime to sexualize underage characters. If this kind of thing is an issue for you, you may not want to get into the Gunsmith Cats manga. Minnie-May is a character that might make some viewers uncomfortable. Her personality and background focuses a lot on her sexuality. She's a former prostitute, having worked for years in a brothel with an inappropriate name that, for politeness sake, we'll refer to as the Purple Kitty. Minnie looks a lot younger than she is and is often treated like a child. Because of this, she tends to use her body and her wealth of sexual experience to fight back against being talked down to. She conflates sexual experience with life experience and believes that by advertising how grown up she is, so to speak, that people will treat her less like a kid and see her as a woman. This is, of course, a childish way of thinking, and it only undermines her attempts to be taken seriously, but it's also a source of discomfort because at the beginning of the series, May is 17. I don't feel like it would be as bad if it was just Minnie-May sexualizing herself, but the images on the chapter title pages frequently include sexy pinup style drawings of the characters, and a number of these include Minnie-May, which communicates pretty clearly that Sonata has no issue sexualizing her for the enjoyment of the reader. Her age not only means the sexual situations we see her in throughout the early parts of the manga are statutory, it also puts her years in the brothel in a much darker light. The original localization of the manga aged her up to 18 to do away with some of these issues, but the revised versions by Dark Horse use the correct age. They basically did the draw a 10-year-old but call them an 800-year-old vampire so it's okay thing. Except with May, it's that she's 17 and they just crossed it out and wrote a different number and called it good. Actually, she still falls into that trope because she's supposed to look like she hasn't aged in the last 4 years, which makes her a character that just looks underage, but is totally legal, dude. So there's not a lot of ambiguity for the kind of people who like to argue about that stuff to latch onto. Another big issue with Minnie May comes from the man that she loves, Ken Takizawa. Ken is the man who makes a brief cameo in the picture in the OVA, and is the love of May's life. He's much older than May, being somewhere in his mid-30s. Ken is an explosives expert and the man that taught her everything she knows about the topic. He appears early on in the comic, needing Raleigh and Minnie to help him out of a jam as he's in deep with the mob and making explosives for them. When he manages to get away, he has to leave Chicago and ends up hiding out in Hollywood for a bit, working as a special effects artist. He's gone for a while in the series, but he ends up coming back later with some plastic surgery and he becomes an important team member, especially when it comes to defusing bombs. For what it's worth, he loves May just as much as she loves him, and they're together for the entire series, even ending up getting married by the end. But the creepiness doesn't just stop at him being a man in his 30s together with a 17-year-old. You see, Ken met May when she was 13. She was a runaway living on the streets and he found her sleeping in his car. Ken ended up taking May in. She lied and told him that she was a boy named Mel, and he teaches her about living on the streets and explosives. Eventually, May reveals her true gender to Ken and professes her love for him. He tries to tell her that she's too young and that there are laws about this sort of thing. But May just says the law shouldn't matter to someone who's a career criminal, which again, does not make this relationship any less creepy. Even though they part ways and then come back together 4 years later, it doesn't change the fact that this relationship started between a 13-year-old and a 31-year-old, which is just gross. Ultimately, it's just something you have to be able to tolerate. If you can ignore it, good. If you can't, you're probably going to want to give the manga a skip. So all of that's pretty uncomfortable, right? I don't mean to say that you can't have uncomfortable content in your series. If you want to write about child prostitution, go for it. But the way in which it's handled and how well it fits in with the rest of the story is important. Gunsmith Cats is not delicate with these topics. May's past is not presented as a bad thing. She's totally happy about her time working at the brothel. She's a legend and all the other girls there look up to her, and she maintains a positive relationship with the woman who ran it. She goes to her for help more than once during the series. May has no issue with the age gap between her and Ken, and she gets upset when people point out that it's weird. Overall, you just don't get the sense that the series is particularly disapproving of Ken and May's relationship. And unlike other situations where characters are the same age, so there's ambiguity, or because she's actually 10,000 years old or something, the specificity here is what makes it uncomfortable. There's even a conversation between May and Granny Howe, the brothel owner, about how May's appearance hasn't changed in all the time she's known her. So you know explicitly how old she's supposed to look. Quick side note, this conversation changed a little bit in the translation, and I ended up checking the original Japanese to verify the differences for myself. Granny Howe says that May had her use her Chinese medicine and acupuncture to keep her from growing because she wanted to look the same for Ken. Now, I see a lot of sources go a step beyond and say that she did it specifically because Ken is into little girls and she wanted to stay desirable to him. I think that this is a bit of a stretch from what we have here. The wikis for the series are few, and the ones that do exist are pretty sparse. A lot of them are just copy and pasted from Wikipedia, but it's unfortunate that some of them get this so wrong. I've even seen one that claims that Ken forces May to take drugs to stay small, and that he's the one that makes the cocktail himself. Looking at my very amateur translation, Granny says that May wanted him to be able to recognize her at a glance, even after a few years. So what she's saying is that the reason May wanted to stay the same is so that he would recognize her, not that that's what he's attracted to. Of course, she goes on to refer to Ken as a lolicon, and she also very uncomfortably comments that she thought May was doing this to attract rich clients who have the kind of tastes that might lead them to take frequent trips to the US Virgin Islands. With that kind of subtext, I can see how, based on this, you would draw the conclusion that May isn't just trying to stay looking the same so that Ken will recognize her, but also that this is the body she was in when they fell in love, and she's not just staying recognizable, she's staying attractive or staying the woman that he loves and not changing into something different. None of that is directly stated, but I think it's a reasonable conclusion that you can draw. But at the very least, it's clear that this happened when they were separated, otherwise her trying to stay recognizable wouldn't make any sense. So it's clear that it was May's choice and not Ken's. Now, despite my complaints about the creep factor of Ken and May's relationship, I should make it clear that it did not ruin the series for me. The first time I read the manga, it didn't bother me that much, although admittedly I also didn't think too hard about it. This time it was a lot more present in my mind, because I'm recommending the series, and I also know what people on the internet are like, and I don't want to be accused of endorsing underage relationships just because I like this series. Because of that, I think I noticed some of the issues a lot more, or was more bothered by them than maybe I would normally be. I think if you aren't someone who has a serious personal issue with this kind of topic, or if you're not flaunting that you're reading the series, or you're treating it more like a guilty pleasure, then maybe it won't prevent you from enjoying everything overall. It's just up to you to make your own decision. I wish I could say it stopped there, but we have to keep that caveat train a-rolling with another disclaimer. Although it might actually be a selling point to some people. This one concerns what could be considered the primary villain of the series, Iron Goldie. While there are other recurring villains that appear in the manga, one of them being Gray, who has a knife hand that actually makes a cameo in the OVA, the true antagonist of the series is Goldie Musso, a member of the Italian mob and a daughter of one of its leaders. Goldie arrives on the scene in Chicago and quickly establishes herself as a force to be reckoned with. She's clever and calculating. She seeks to understand her enemies and use their own nature against them, whether that's using her knowledge of police procedure to know where to plant bombs during a bank heist, or knowing exactly who to use as a human shield against our heroines. This ability to control every element of an encounter, to dictate her opponent's actions and always know what's about to happen, is a manifestation of her personality, in that she is obsessively controlling. And that, as it often can, leads her to have a very domineering personality. And this is where things start to get a bit uncomfortable. Goldie is a lesbian, and Goldie has a thing for domination. She takes sexual advantage of the women she's captured. After having clashed with Raleigh a few times, she becomes obsessed with her, and a core part of that obsession is her attraction to her. She wants to make Raleigh her own, to have her, control her. And what we end up with is a sexually aggressive dominatrix who wants to make a submissive out of her rival, and things start to get pretty fetishy on more than one occasion. But even that, while occasionally creepy, is only part of what I think I need to warn you about. You see, the other big thing about Goldie is that she's a genius at pharmacology. The way that she's able to rise through the mafia and consolidate control is that she's developed a new kind of drug called kerosene. Kerosene, or Powerball as it's known on the streets, is a wonder drug that sort of acts like LSD but becomes more like PCP if you take a lot of it. She floods the market with it for cheap and quickly gains a huge amount of control over the Chicago drug trade, thanks to her being the only one who knows how to make it. But kerosene has another, more important trait. It makes the user incredibly susceptible to hypnotic suggestion. Because of this, kerosene is a perfect tool for brainwashing. Goldie has several girls that she's captured and thoroughly brainwashed with her kerosene. She uses these girls as sex slaves and has ordered them that if they're ever liberated from her control, to take their own lives. These girls are so thoroughly under her control that they're genuinely happy to be her servants. They love her and want to please her. Or at least they think they do. Goldie tries to do the same thing to Raleigh, and although she ultimately fails, that doesn't mean Raleigh doesn't deal with a hell of a time resisting the drug, and end up with some heavy traumatic baggage moving forward. So that's my second big caveat for Gunsmith Cats. There's an element of sexual slavery using a mind control drug, and a pretty rapey main antagonist. This element is handled slightly better than the whole May and Ken thing. Like, the series acknowledges that it's horrible and our heroes are trying to stop it, but it also gets used for a lot of TNA moments that occasionally make you think that Sonata's one of those people that maybe gets off to the whole mind control thing. So if you're someone that's bothered by this, you might want to just give the manga a skip and stick to the OVA. All of this brings me to my last negative for the manga, the ending. This is spoiler territory, so I'll put a warning on the screen so that you can avoid them if you choose, but before you do, you should just know that the ending of Gunsmith Cats Burst is not good. A lot of people complain about it, and I would recommend stopping around chapter 27 or 28 of Burst if you don't feel inclined to finish everything. So, spoilers. but basically the ending of the series is that the bad guy wins. Goldie comes back to Chicago, but she's lost her memory after her first encounter with Raleigh ended up with what seemed like her death. She gets her memory back and develops a new version of kerosene called Darkball, which again begins to flood the streets. Meanwhile, Goldie manages to capture Misty, a friend of Raleigh and May who is a reformed cat burglar. Misty is a regular character and she helps out how she can, but she also never really does anything super important and is mostly used for a lot of jokes about how she's in love with Raleigh, so I haven't really mentioned her yet. Anyway, Raleigh has to leave Misty behind, unsure of her fate. A short time later, she comes across her in public, and talking to her, it's pretty clear she's been brainwashed, although she claims she wasn't. Misty explains that she wants to stay with Goldie, and that Goldie being in charge of the Mafia is the safest thing for everybody because it'll bring stability to the Chicago underground. Later on, she confirms that she was injected with something, but she claims it was just a sedative or something to help her calm down and see reason. She even claims to be in love with Goldie, although she also says that she thinks that both of them are just using each other as a substitute for Raleigh. In the end, they get a sample of the drug, which involves Bean making one last drug run, but it's all pointless because Raleigh just sits down and talks with Misty and ultimately decides that she's gonna let her stay with Goldie and stop fighting. Goldie gets to keep Misty and stay in power, while May and Ken have a baby and move to the suburbs, and Raleigh gives up bounty hunting. It's ridiculous. It's so abrupt and so out of character for everybody. Misty is a brainwashed slave and Goldie faces no consequences for everything she's done. She's happy to keep everyone around because they're predictable and not a threat to her power, so really, she just wins. Raleigh gives up, something that has definitely not been part of her character throughout the rest of the series. It really leaves a bad taste in your mouth, and it's why so many people hate it. This is one I could say I really wish would get a continuation, especially with how abrupt and unsatisfying the ending is. I mean, it basically ends in the middle of an arc, like you could just pick it up and finish it. But Sonata just kickstarted and produced a brief animation project in a different world than this one, so it's not following this storyline. And all that really makes a proper conclusion to Gunsmith Cats feel way less likely. Yeah, so things have gotten pretty negative, and I think that means it's time to turn things around because I don't want to end this on a low note. So let's get back to something positive, the writing. I know you probably wouldn't expect it considering how long I just spent telling you the ending is awful, but Gunsmith Cat's writing is actually pretty good. You can split good writing into well-written characters and well-written plot, and I would argue that Gunsmith Cats has both. While some aspects of the characters may make people uncomfortable, I don't think you could say they're poorly written. Raleigh is a compelling protagonist who has a well-established personality and moral code that occasionally clashes with the job she has to do, while also protecting her friends. May's insecurities about her height and her status as Raleigh's partner shine through her upbeat confidence to add an extra layer of depth to her. Bean's tough, business-like exterior shows cracks through which shines a heart of gold and a strong sense of right and wrong. Even Goldie has a past in Sicily that makes her a bit more sympathetic, although it doesn't excuse her crimes. Most of these characters have a lot more going for them than you usually find in manga. They're not just one-dimensional tropes. They have arcs that span the series, and they're different people when we leave them at the end than they were in the beginning. But the stories told also succeed in being compelling, suspenseful, and not always easy to predict. The extent of Sonata's knowledge regarding guns, cars, and various real-life weaponry gives things an added layer of believability that helps keep things slightly more grounded, while Raleigh pulls off impossible feats of marksmanship, and Bean does things with a car that are probably against the laws of physics. Each of these stories could be an episode of a crime procedural, or maybe a low-budget action movie. The lack of a continuous overarching story doesn't detract from the different cases staying high stakes and engaging. You feel genuine concern for the Magic Man when the guy he's helping commit a robbery is threatening to punch in the code to detonate the bomb collar he's placed on his daughter. Your heart leaps as May and Becky escape captivity armed with only their wits and a bit of plastic explosive. You root for Raleigh to stop Bean's drug delivery so he'll swear off running them for good because damn it, they're perfect for each other and I just want them to be friends. The fact that so many hate the ending is really just a testament to how much the readers love these characters and want to see them succeed. The backbone of a good narrative is characters, story, and setting, and in my mind, Gunsmith Cats exceeds at all three. It fills a niche that I don't think any other manga can say it does. And for that alone, it's at least worth checking out. Whether you start with the OVA or jump straight into the source material, you might just end up finding a new favorite. If you love action, if you love excitement, and if you love a little bit of sex on top, then you absolutely should read the fucking manga.